been 4 years since Russia annexed Crimea. On the night of February 27, 2014, armed men seized the Supreme Court Council of Crimea. The little green man turned out to be from the Russian military, a fact later even confirmed by Russian President Vladimir Putin. That's how the Russian Federation's annexation of the Ukrainian part of the peninsula began. Crimeans have responded to the annexation in different ways. Some struggle to adjust. It's difficult to accept that you live in a concentration camp, one person said to me during my last trip to Crimea. Others have adapted better to living under Russia's occupation and openly talk about the differences between life in the two countries. And there are also those who celebrate the annexation. During this show, we will discuss political freedom and economic development in Crimea, violation of Western sanctions, and also how the situation had impacted Crimean youth. We have in our studio Iryna Brunova-Kalisetska, who is herself an internally displaced person from Crimea. Iryna is the social psychologist and conflictologist. She works for the Integration and Development Center for Information and Research. Good evening. Before we kick the discussion, we'd like to show our interview with Artem Chiygos, who is the deputy chair of the Majlis Assembly of the Crimean Tatar people. He was sentenced by Russia to 8 years in prison and spent 2.5 years behind the bars, but was freed last autumn after negotiations between Russian President Vladimir Putin and Turkish leader Recep Tayyip Erdogan. The Russian authorities accused Chiygos of organizing mass disturbance outside the Crimean Supreme Council in February 2014, as Russia was annexing the peninsula. But the video you've just seen, there was evidence which demonstrated that Chiygos was trying to calm the protesters. So Chiygos' trial was marked by a number of serious violations, including the use of secret witnesses and the fact that Chiygos was only allowed to appear in court via video link. Currently, he is in Kiev. He recounts how Russia seized the Crimean Peninsula, the processes that led to its annexation, and his hopes for Crimean future.
We had this anxiety about Russia's increasing presence in Crimea for a long time, and during these moments, these separatist groups, the groups that always existed there, got more and more active. Groups such as Cossacks and all these politicians who have been speculating on the Russian world rhetoric, but never had any actual connection to Russia. And these processes were quite frequent. Not long before that, in 2004, the same thing was happening. I remember all these worries mobilizing us as a national group, not as individual activists or civil societies. So without carrying out any specific preparations, we as a nation became capable of resisting this. That's why from November onward we started meeting up quite regularly, and this wasn't even subject for discussion. Or let's say the pessimists didn't discuss the need to support the Euro integration processes and the Euromaidan in Kiev. Crimean Tatars would just flock together and take a train to Kiev. And I did the same thing for many months. From November onward we represented the Majlis community at the Euromaidan. This showed us that in reality, the people living in Crimea have already moved on from the moods that were prevalent in the 1990s. Do you understand what I mean? First of all, the lawmakers from the Party of Regions did not provoke any feeling of respect. All of them were half criminals, discredited within society, so they had no reason to think that they could be backed by the public. The public did not support them, bar some marginal groups. But what support did they have to work with? As strange as this might sound, the support from the law enforcement institutions, because law enforcement institutions were formed with a relationship with Russia in mind, the relationship with Russians, not pro-Ukrainians. These people did not consider Ukraine their state, their motherland.
At what point did it hit you that this is getting serious, that it won't end soon?
On February 27, 2014, before that, 2 weeks or maybe 10 days before that, I was returning from Kiev. There was a big group of us and I told them one thing. After we were freed from prison, I was reminded of my words. I told them that a war was to follow. Now they ask me how did I know, but I didn't mean it in the sense of a war with Russia. I meant that there will be some sort of internal opposition that might escalate into an armed conflict, especially in Crimea. That's probably how it was going to be. And then Russia intervened. Then Russia sent its troops. We had no doubt that it was pro-Russian special forces that seized the local administration building. I'm telling you that a week before this, Sevastopol already carried out all organizational measures for its separation from Crimea. All of this couldn't happen without help from Russia's special forces.
How do you see Crimea's deoccupation?
I think that there is no way of doing it using force, and recently I started to realize that there is no need for the use of force if we, as a state, along with our partners, continue to put pressure on Russia. Perhaps many people think that 3 or 4 years is a long time, but it will take some time for a monster like Putin to burn down. When I talked to the FSB people from Moscow who came to visit me, I realized that they aren't indifferent, which means that these measures that we're taking hit them in the right spots. The other point is that we need to increase this pressure and demand for Europe and the United States to do the same.
So we're joined by Iryna Brunova-Kalisetska, who is the conflictologist, social psychologist, and herself is coming from Crimea. It's already 4 years, hard to speak, and when we travel, when we look, a lot of people would say the things remains the same somehow. Some of the situation is deteriorating if you speak about human rights violation, but really what kind of impact, how we can describe the Crimeans, the Crimeans who come here, Crimeans who stayed at the occupied peninsula, and their mood?
Well, I would say it's hard to imagine that things are same in terms of psychology, especially the social psychology, taking into account what kind of propaganda Russia puts on its population and now on the population of Crimea. What I mean, the whole policy block of influence, like youth policy, cultural policy, memory policy, educational policy now includes a lot of militarization that was not there, of course, during the independence time of Ukraine in Crimea. What we can follow, even in open resources, a lot of programs, a lot of activities, a lot of celebrations are addressed to show that the war is normal, that the war is romanticized, and that to be a Russian means to be military person. And that gets scary because, as we see, the youth is prepared to give the life just for nothing, and just decreasing the value of life itself for Crimean youth. Of course, it's scary.
And of course, I would remind, if you really travel to Crimea, especially on the days like the 9th of May, which is a victory day, or any kind of the celebration, you see the kids in the military uniform, you see the monuments of those little green men there. I would like our, how the people, you said it wasn't present, how it's influenced the, maybe is it making people more scared? Are they usually what trying to hide what they think? How do you explain also this kind of a double speak that people are there? Because it's very hard to communicate to the people. They're trying to adjust it. So what is this psychology of adjustment?
Well, adjustment is a normal process for any humankind in this or that situation. Adjustment means that people try to look how to live their lives, how to feed their families, how to earn some money, how to, how to think about better future for their children. And adjustments means just a normal process. But for those who didn't celebrate this annexation, for those who stay Ukrainians in terms of civic nation of Ukraine, but too many reasons cannot leave Crimea and to move out, of course they're scary. Those who are in contact with us, with those who had to move out, they say we are waiting for Ukraine to come back. They're afraid to speak it out because since 9th of May 2014, to proclaim that Crimea is Ukraine means a criminal responsibility in terms of Russian legislation since 2014. So of course people hide a lot, but on the other hand, what we desperately need, I would say, is European or international scholars who would be able to enter Crimea and to understand more. For me as a social psychologist, it's clear that without being able to enter, I'm not able to enter Crimea, it means that I cannot research in a normal way what is going on there. So that for me it is the very important thing to ask international scholar community to, especially those who do research in social sciences, to put more attention and to go there and to see what is going on.
I would like also to bring the graph, which is done by the number of the initiatives tracking the destinies of the political prisoners in Crimea. There are more than 60 people. Majority of them, they are in Crimea, but some of them, up to 20, are held in Russia, in Rostov, or even in Siberia, as Alexentsov and Alexander Kolchenko. We can see, like it's very hard, in fact, for the human rights activists even to have these, graphs, because you constantly need to update them. So it just given, we can't even read every single name at the moment. We just know there are dozens of people, and you can't even go to any personal story, but it also makes the people scared. How you think this idea of this, also the armed resistance or any kind of resistance is currently resembling the Crimean Tatars and Crimeans who stayed in that in the annexed peninsula, how their psychology and also is changing due to this constant threat of being searched, being arrested.
This is the policy of Russia to threaten any kind of resistance, not only in Crimea, but in the territory of Russia itself. To threaten any kind of another opinion, I would say, to be spoken out. We can follow it in many cases in a variety of regions of Russia. But in terms of Crimea, it means that especially Crimean Tatars, who maybe the most consolidated anti-Russian or anti-annexation part of the population, what Russia tries to do is not only to threaten by these cases and detainment, but also in not very evident way, like splitting Crimean Tatar population, rewriting national identity into religious one, in order to diminish any kind of claiming the national movement among Crimean Tatars that we have for 70 years nonviolent.
I would like, also in this map, you in fact see, or you can in fact to have the different graph. I will ask to show, and it also goes to the, there are different kind of cases brought up again. So you see, there are the cases of the so-called Ukrainian saboteurs. You see there are the waves of the rest. There was a famous case of the 26th of the February case. It's the day of the annexation. But also, there are people who are banned to travel to Crimea. But what is also interesting, in particular, because the Crimean Tatars is a Muslim minority, and when we speak to the lawyers, human rights lawyers, they usually say that the practicing Muslim would be accused of terrorism. The political, those who used to cooperate with Mejlis, Crimean Tatar Assembly, would be kind of go to the extremist cases. So really, how do you think this, what are the, knowing Crimea, how are these idea of putting the Muslim, putting the Islam, and kind of putting the tag of the terrorism into that, how it generally might influence on the radicalization of the youth? And just general perception of the Crimean Tatars as radicals, which wasn't ever the case.
I would see it in more complicated way. First of all, when Russia entered Crimea in 2014, I would say that their views on what Islam is was based on North Caucasus issues, and who are Crimean Tatars, what is the nation of Crimean Tatars, and what's the way of practicing Islam for Crimean Tatar is, they had no idea. So all the practices of dealing with the minority or dealing with something which is different from Moscow Orthodox Patriarchy was quite based on what Russia did in North Caucasus. Whereas Crimean Tatars are quite different way of, they have another way of practicing Islam, although there were a lot of different subgroups, which was okay in Ukraine, as Ukraine has probably the most liberal legislation towards different religious groups. So, first of all, I should say that Russian policy is different. Second of all, I would say that the Russian policy towards Islam in Crimea is to split again to the right believers who are under Moscow, including the Muftiyat, which seems very loyal to Russian authorities, and all the other Muslims that either forbidden in Russia, like Hizb Tahrir, or others that show those Crimean Tatars who practicing Islam but also show loyalty to Ukraine. So there are more backgrounds in this. As for radicalization, I am afraid it could take place in a couple of years ahead if Russia will continue such pressure on Crimean Tatars.
That's exactly how radicalization works. You can really create it from the constant threats where the people see that they are powerless, that they can't affect in any other way. But I would like also to go to the issue of the sanctions to show our story. So on paper, US and the EU sanctions on Russia prevent companies from doing business with the Crimean Peninsula. Airlines shouldn't fly there, ships shouldn't dock in Crimean ports, and credit cards shouldn't work there. However, in reality, many companies are covertly violating sanctions. And other claims that there are no control over where there are goods travel and where their services functions. So we look how effective sanctions are in occupied Crimea. There is a story by our colleague Natalia Vikhrov.
In 2014, the European Organization for the Safety of Air Navigation banned flights to the illegally annexed Crimean Peninsula. But according to the Black Sea Institute of Strategic Studies and Maidana Foreign Affairs, who monitor illegal flights to occupied Crimea, more than half a dozen Russian airlines continue to fly to Crimea. In 2014, Dobrolyot, the subsidiary of Russian airline Aeroflot, was slapped with European sanctions, and as a result, the company's assets in the European Union were frozen, and its counterparties there annulled insurance agreements. They also halted leasing, repair, and maintenance agreements. In autumn of the same year, Russia created the new low-cost Pobeda airline. But after the saga with Dobrolyot, this subsidiary does not fly to Crimea. However, Aeroflot is among a number of airlines that continue to transport passengers between Russia and Crimea. It's worth noting that attempts by occupation authorities to open the international connection have failed. But aircrafts continue to fly to occupied Crimea, sometimes on the same day that they fly to the United States and the European Union. For example, on January 10, an Aeroflot aircraft flew from Sochi to Simferopol, later it returned to Sochi, then flew to Moscow, and from there flew to the Norwegian capital of Oslo. The Maidana Foreign Affairs estimates that these kinds of breaches have occurred more than 100 times in 2017 alone. According to Black Sea News, 23 aircrafts operated by 7 Russian airlines flew to occupied Crimea on February 22. At the end of last year, Aeroflot CEO Vitaly Savelyev said that for the first time in 4 years, he feels like sanctions could actually be imposed against the company, which is one of the 20 largest air carriers in the world. But so far, this remains just a risk.
So if you would like to explore the database of airplanes that flew to occupied Crimea and then to EU member states, the United States and the other destinations last year, it's available in English. Go to the webpage of the Black Sea Institute of Strategic Studies. You can find it on our Twitter and also on the comments of our Facebook Live. The Black Sea Institute of the Strategic Studies monitors flights and ships that violate the Ukrainian and international maritime sanctions against Russia-occupied Crimea. You know, the question would be, I recently talked to a couple of people who come from Crimea to Kiev, you know, while traveling. And there is this feeling that, you know, the West is taking it, for granted, the things that which had happened. People would like to do the business as usual. These kind of things, like breaching the sanctions, are felt very, with huge disappointment by the people who stays. So really, how this kind of feeling of inaction, feeling of not enough of pressure towards Russia by the West also could influence the society?
Well, first of all, I should say that I'm following the new wave of migration from Crimea to Ukraine, which is consisted of people who get tired to wait for something that should change the current status of Crimea being back to Ukraine, or things like that. And it means that people who waited for 4 years that something will be changed with the help of European Union or NATO or US, that they need to continue their life somehow else. For the other people who stayed in Crimea, who continue to wait for some activities, unfortunately, it's probably a very sad reality that there's no actual way to do it fast. Since the beginning of the Second World War, there was no such a case when brutally a country would seize the territory of another country. So there is no mechanism, international mechanism, just sanctions that would force in a legal way without taking violence or weapons out to force Russia to come back to the status quo that we have before the February of 2014.
If we would like to go back to the issue of the sanctions, because we also talked to Halina Koinash, a member of the Kharkiv Human Rights Protection Group. She is following the situation also with the human rights violations. So again, my colleague Natalie Vichro spoke to Halina Koinash about sanction violation, as well as the upcoming Russian presidential elections, which will take in a couple of weeks.
I think the most serious breach of sanctions has been Siemens, which has ignored warnings from everybody for 2 years and has been pretending for 2 years that it is in full compliance. And it's probably the most drastic of the occasions, because they have provided gas turbines to Crimea, which is very, very serious, because, Crimea depends on Ukraine, for mainland Ukraine, for energy naturally, and this breach of sanctions is a very serious one, and that one is really a case where they simply continued to say that they were in full compliance with sanctions, and they know nothing about any possible breach, even though they were theoretically providing gas turbines for a plant that wasn't being built. And they knew it wasn't being built. It was clear from 2016 that they were providing gas turbines for nowhere, unless they were indeed going to Crimea, and they just ignored it. That one is one where I hope the German prosecutor will get involved. At the moment, it's not clear. Other people are using more sort of clever ways around it. For example, Visa and MasterCard moved out of Crimea, indeed. They were following sanctions. And then Russia brought in a system whereby everybody has to be registered in Moscow. And now MasterCard and Visa are both claiming that they have that they have no control over the situation, that this is all about Russia having taken control over their transactions, and they cannot control whether somebody is actually making those transactions in Crimea or in Russia.
Whose responsibility is it to enforce these sanctions, and why aren't they doing so?
Well, this is the problem. The EU, when you ask them, will say that it's in the business of the individual country. The individual company will say that the country will then say that they seem to pass the I've forgotten what it's called, but they pass the responsibility to somebody else. Mm-hmm. nobody seems to be taking full responsibility for this.
We are less than a month away from the Russian elections, which will be illegally held in Crimea as well on March 18. We've heard from, the Kremlin-installed Crimea head Sergei Aksyonov has already alleged that there could be a terrorist threat or possible provocations in the lead-up. What can we expect from the authorities in the coming weeks in the lead-up to the election?
Well, there's already been one person who's been arrested, a Ukrainian, who has joined the very large number of other, I mean, there are probably 66 already known political prisoners, people who have been arrested for reasons that really do not bear scrutiny. And the last one was just Davidenko, I think his name is, was arrested maybe a few weeks ago, and it was just after Aksyonov had talked about this supposed terrorist threat from Ukraine. I think, you know, they will probably try to invent some more terrorist threats, sabotage threats, and so forth. It's, you know, it's a good time to do it. It's a way of scaring the population and pushing the propaganda line.
Somehow the elections, the Crimea issue hadn't been really the issue for the Russian current presidential elections, in fact, compared to just one candidate, Ksenia Sobchak, somehow mentioned that she agreed that Crimea should be back into Ukraine, but after the referendum. So really, how do you see these elections and also the impact and the fact that people go to the polls there?
Well, Crimea is so big for Russian politics, has played its role 4 years ago. So it's no any kind of, you know, way to use it by Putin, let's say, again, because it has played its role totally. But what is important when Ksenia Sobchak speaking about let's make another referendum which will be more fair, it's not the case, because the population of Crimea, which we see there, which we can estimate, was replaced up to 20%. Up to 20% new inhabitants from Russia were moving to Crimea, and nobody would recognize such a referendum, even not taking into account that in Ukrainian legislation there is no such a point to have a referendum in Crimea. It was not in 2014, and as well in Russia, as I said before, it is a criminal responsibility to claim for such a referendum.
And I should add also, like, talking to different international events, like conferences, answering the question on the referendum prior to the annexation, on the opportunity to have it, what the sociologists usually used to say, that there was never more than 50% of the population ever supporting the joining the Russia. So there was no really any factual base or really to hold this referendum. But my last question would be also on the actions of the Ukrainian government. As to the social psychologists and conflictologists, you know, look, there is a blockade to some extent. There is also some kind of the, in the public debate, there are sometimes topics that, you know, those people in Crimea, they maybe wanted that. I see sometimes the disappointment of some of the Crimeans who moved here, who moved to Kiev, that it's not exactly an issue. So really how it influenced on the society, and you yourself, what do you think the Ukrainian state and the Ukrainian society could do differently?
I would say this is a question for another interview for about half an hour to answer. I myself, I've never relied on any government, and I've never relied on the state itself. I'm a person who rely on my own, and I didn't expect that state would do something. On the other hand, the processes in the Ukrainian politics since 2014, after the Revolution of Dignity, I would say, didn't have enough resources to support people from Crimea. Probably it could be done more if we would be, I don't know, Norway in terms of resources, but Ukraine has a lot of other issues to solve as well. This is very good that we have human rights activists and groups who push the government to do something, but I'm not expect a lot.
Okay, thanks a lot for this talk. It was Iryna Brunova-Kalisetska, who is also herself had to move from Crimea.